I think it's time to jump back on the great buff to potions and pirates, because this post was made about a month ago now, the 30th of September, and they did say that we will rebalance between 10 and 20 cards per week for the next 6 or 7 weeks. And the first set of buffs was actually really nice to see, the great buff to potions and pirates, which of course encompassed anti-fire potion, unstable concoction, and these were all of their suggested changes. Not all of them went through, since there was a lot of community feedback. They took that on board, and some changes didn't get through, such as Ghost Ship here, which I personally think probably should cost 2 gold, but still costing 3, that didn't get through, and other things as well, like, for example, Unstable Concoction, which I personally think should deal 9 damage. But that's not the point. Not everyone's going to agree with me there, but I think hopefully everybody will agree with me on the topic that can we get started with the changes? We haven't seen any, for about 4 weeks now, and I think that is, partly to do with Jagex being very busy with the Trials of Radimus. Updates always for game studios are going to be stressful, right? And I think there have been some internal changes going on with the team that might be a bit stressful to deal with as well. But hopefully we can get back to these changes soon, and I wanted to do some suggested balance changes. So I'm going to put a link to this in the description, also put it on the Reddit, but I'll talk through in my voice. I'm going to do a one take, no restarts, and no editing, hopefully. Alright, so let me talk you through my suggested balance changes. In this video, I would like to talk about some of the most egregious cards in the game. So what I mean by that are perhaps the strongest, most overpowered cards. The ones that leave you a bit feeling like, what the fuck, I'm not sure if I really want this in the game. The cards that are a bit silly and feel a bit unfair. I'm going to talk about that today, and then next week I would like to talk about improving gold, and then the week after something else which I haven't thought about just yet. But gold, that's really something quite important to me, because I feel like that's one of the best things about Chronicle. Like when I first started collecting gold and then choosing what to spend it on, I thought that was one of the most interesting parts of the game, and it's a shame that it's not really very prevalent in the high-level aspect of the game. I feel like just currently decks that try to generate gold and then spend that gold on, something like base attack or stats or damage or whatever it is, they just don't compete as well. They're just not as strong as decks that just kill creatures to really do the same thing. And I'll talk about how I think gold could be improved next week, and perhaps why it's not so strong. But right now, let's start with the egregious cards, perhaps the most egregious card in the entire game, Mr. Varago, that has undergone changes before, but currently still has the same problem that it has always had. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the most interesting parts of Chronicle is that gold gain, but also just character progression generally. I think Chronicle does that really well. When I first started playing in the closed beta, I felt like Chronicle really emulated what RuneScape was to me in its sort of card game form, taking a low-level character that has nothing to his name, and then training him up by killing creatures, generating the XPs and leveling up, which is effectively gaining base attack, and also, killing boss monsters for cool loot and gold and what have you to sort of take your RuneScape character in the direction that you want to. Chronicle, I really liked that about it. I thought it was really, really great game. Still is a great game, but you'd expect a game like that to, the cards you're playing and the decisions you're making and the order of which you are doing things in, you'd expect all of that to actually mean something on the outcome of the game. But in the AP mirror matchup, of course in other matchups Varago's not quite as strong, but that's what we're getting onto. Varago just ruins that character progression aspect. It just destroys it, and it changes the game from being about all of the small things and eking out this advantage and trying to get a bit of armor here and saving some health there and doing things in a certain order to gain perhaps an advantage. It just destroys all of that, and when Varago is in the equation, it's more about just rolling a dice on seeing who can draw Varago by the end of the game and not discard it to KGP Agent or Scarface Pete or whatever it is, right? Varago might as well just say on it, instead of draw a weapon or whatever it says, it should just say, your odds to win the game go up by 75%. I hate how focused the game is now on, oh, he discarded my Varago, oh, yay, I discarded his Varago. It shouldn't feel like that. It's really disheartening to think that the plays you're making don't really have that much impact. Yes, they have some impact. You can't just, do nothing and then go to the chapter 5 and play Varago. Of course, you have to get to the point where you can kill a Varago. But, that's all the game's about in the AP mirror matchup, and it's not fun. I want the game to be about, you know, eking out the small advantages and playing efficiently, and I just want the stuff you do to actually matter. So my solution would really be delete Varago from the game, please. Obviously, I don't really want to see him deleted. He's a cool boss monster from RuneScape and has a place in Chronicle, but the effect that he has right now needs to be gone, and something else needs to take its place. Alright, next up is Scarface Pete, and something that I noticed about this card during the campaign, you know, the Trials of Radimus that came out recently, was that Scarface Pete really wasn't very good against a lot of those bosses, and for those that don't know, I have been speedrunning the campaigns. I'm going to try and do it as fast as possible. I'm going to try and get all the stars. Well, obviously I've already gotten all of the stars, but I'm going to do all of the bosses again in a row as if I don't have the stars and try and collect all the stars as fast as possible. And I'll put that video on this YouTube channel when it's done and when I set the time that I want to. But I ended up taking Scarface Pete out of a lot of the decks that I was using against those bosses because it really wasn't very impactful. A lot of the time the cards that I would discard just weren't very good, and it just didn't really affect the game very much, because those bosses, a lot of them are really strong, not because of the cards that Jagex put in their decks, but more because they start with, you know, additional base attack, or they start with a bunch of gold, or a weapon, or whatever it is. Yeah, Scarface Pete didn't really discard very many good cards for my rival, and as a result just wasn't really very impactful. I ended up taking it out and putting in something much better, just something more useful, and I think this rings true to... Well, basically I've written it here. This card scales up in power level the more ranks you climb. I think against lower level players or people in Dungeoneering, you know, their decks just aren't going to be as good. So the cards you discard on average will not be that good. And against a player with a much better optimized deck, the impact you will have on, you know, on their hand is just going to be so much more, because all of the cards in their hand are going to be much more synergetic and just stronger, and you're just going to disrupt them a lot more doing that. So I think Scarface Pete is not as big of a problem at the lower ranks. I think people don't necessarily see Scarface as a big deal down there. But the further up you go, especially against decks that rely on very particular cards to win the game, like Varago that I mentioned, but also Earth Blast, you know, Earth Wave, Death, whatever it is for Ariane, and Corp Beast, and there are other cards as well that are ran in decks that are very, very key to winning. And, you know, because those kind of decks are quite popular at the moment, because, you know, Varago is so strong, and Earth Blast, and, well, Ariane is you know, quite good, I think the popularity of Scarface Pete is more than it really ought to be. I think the power level it represents is just high right now, because of, you know, if those other things were changed, Scarface wouldn't be as good. But even if that did happen, I still think Scarface is, like, baseline very strong, right? It's still much better than, say, something like Dagonoff Sentinel, which is not particularly strong anymore. So I can still see Scarface being ran over that card in, say, something like Raptor. And as a result of that, I just think Scarface just needs to be made, you know, a bit more punishing. Because right now, it's very easy to kill when, you know, just on 3 base attack. All you need is 3 base attacks, so all you have to do is gain 1 AP off a KGP Penguin, or whatever it is, and then you can 3-hit kill the Scarface Pete, and that's an investment of only 8 life for an effect that is very crippling, especially early on. That's one of the best times to do it, because if you discard 3 cards at the start of the game, then they have 3 less cards for the entire rest of the game, right? But if you do that on Chapter 3, they only have 3 less cards for the remaining 2 chapters. Obviously, I understand that discarding their cards on Chapter 3 and 4 can be better, because by that time they're more likely to have a Varago or an Earth Blast in their hand. You know, Chapter 1, they might not necessarily have those cards in their hand because they'll mulligan them away. I get that, but, like, just as a raw value proposition, let's ignore, you know, these harder to measure intrinsic things like them having certain cards in their hand. Just like, it's better to discard early on than it is later on, in the same way that it's better to draw early on than it is to draw later on, right? Like, that's the thing I'm getting at. So I think the strength of Scarface Pete is how early it can be played. And that's because the creature isn't very big to kill. I think to fix that, you just need to make it a bit bigger of a creature. So I've written here, make it an 8-9, which is the same stat line as Dagonoff Sentinel. That's why I picked it. But really, it could be any stat line. Just it needs to be bigger than it is currently. An 8-9 I think would be good. It keeps the 9 healthness of it, which I like about Scarface, but just makes it something that is a lot more punishing to kill in 3 hits, and only a little bit more punishing to kill in 2 hits, which is really what it ought to be killed in, I think. So that's Scarface Pete. Alright, up next we do have Ogre Warlord, and I think if we're going to talk about this card, it's best to begin with a kind of more general discussion on hard counters, because that's what Ogre Warlord is, this big, lumbering, destroy all the meaningful armor that your opponent has stacked up card. But also, it's this really useful early game tool for getting a base attack early on that's not too hard to kill. Or I should say not too punishing to kill, right? Given that you get a 5 armor reward afterwards. Kind of like the old Daganov Sentinel. So Ogre Warlord's really good because it has these two functions. I start with a very strong position. I would argue that all hard counters are dumb, and I am aware that that's a very, big thing to say. I think certainly a lot of people would disagree, namely Frebidikaka. I think he would argue that no interjection, actually, hard counters are needed. And I think there is some truth to that. I think counters are needed. Certainly counters are good. That's what makes Chronicle, or just card games generally, or even just video games generally. Competitive games need counterplay, right? Otherwise, it doesn't feel as fun, doesn't feel like you can be in as much control over what your opponent's doing. You can't, like, shape and direct the flow of the game as easily. I think counters are needed. But all of the hard counters, or I should say all of the good counters in Chronicle, are just so strong and just, I want to say, like, kind of ungraceful. In the past, we had a card called, well, we still have that card. It's called Redbeard Frank. But it used to say, both players remove all of their gold. And you'd also draw 2 cards. So it was actually really good, even if you didn't remove any gold from anyone, because it's almost as good as Krasian at that point. There were, well, not the Amulet of Fury is played even now, but like it certainly couldn't have been played when Redbeard was a thing, and really any other card that costed a big amount of gold. Because as soon as your opponent saw you stacking like any number of gold, like something like 5 or 6 gold, or you're heading towards that Karam or whatever it is you might want to buy, boom, right? There's Redbeard Frank, and they remove all of your gold, they reset that completely. It just, basically what it did was completely nullify all of the cards that costed any amount of gold in the collection. You just could not think about putting those in your deck. Not that you think about those ones particularly much right now at the top level in Chronicle, and as I mentioned earlier, we'll talk about that next video, but certainly when Redbeard was there, gold was not a thing, and it could never be a thing, so Redbeard was changed. And I think Ogre Warlord has, to an extent, a similar effect. I think all hard counters have this kind of effect where they just kind of remove a whole bunch of cards from the collection at the top level, and that obviously reduces options and variety and just makes the game, less interesting. So I think that's why hard counters are bad. And also, you're playing Armor Raptor, you have 94 armor and 30 life because you've just Sara Brood back up to full again, and you feel really good about yourself because you've got this cool deck, and then boom, right? Ogre Warlord comes out. They didn't really require any planning for them to do that. All they did was hold on to it. It just feels so disheartening and dumb that you can just remove all of their armor. I really don't like that about the game. So I feel like Ogre Warlord needs changing. I think changing Green Dragon and Raging Calphite, which are the other cards that remove all armor, like, what would I change them to? That's a completely different discussion, because I think remove all armor is this silly effect. But that's not the discussion I'm going to have right now, so I'll talk about Green Dragon and Raging Calphite maybe another time. But Ogre Warlord in particular, I think that card needs changing right now, whereas the others don't, because they don't have as much kind of upside. There's just almost no risk to running an Ogre Warlord, because as I mentioned earlier, you can just use it as useful early game base attack, right? It's a creature that rewards base attack. That's really valuable in and of itself, and the fact that it's also a hard counter just makes it so damn versatile. It's just so above the curve, that card, compared to other things. So I think what you ought to do for this card is, I would personally like to just remove the effect entirely, in the sense that it cannot destroy armor, like I've written here. Reword the card to increase both legends' armor to 5. So if they have 3 armor, they'll go up to 5, right? If they have 1 armor, they'll go up to 5. If they have 8 armor, they cannot go up to 5 because they're already above 5, right? It doesn't destroy any armor, but it still gives both players, an increase in armor if they don't happen to have already 5 armor. And I don't know how you'd word that to make it immediately passable for new players. A new player might not get it right away, so maybe it does need some kind of tweaking to get that effect on it. But also other effects are fine too. If you do want to keeping it as a hard counter, which I'd rather not do, I think it needs to have the Kaizaj tournament treatment. For those that don't know, Kaizaj only used to give you base attack. And now it gives both players base attack. I think if Ogre Warlord, if it was going to keep the effect it has currently, I think it ought to give both players a base attack. That makes it a lot less good to run. It just needs to be less popular, because right now I just think armor removal is significantly more prevalent than it really ought to be. And I do think that's quite stifling on some aspects of the game, certainly some decks out there. So that's my change. Alright, up next is Tormented Demon, and I think this is a card that not very many people are complaining about, but really is just far too strong and, in my opinion, not healthy for the game. And I say that because, well, it keeps stemming back to gold. I keep mentioning in my next video I'm going to talk about why gold is perhaps not as good as it ought to be and some of the problems that gold game decks have. I think Tormented Demon is just a big reason why gold isn't popular, because there is no card in the game as good as this one for getting you started in the early game. Providing you can kill it, which is not too hard to do. Slime Toes can be ran in every single deck. Ariane has Crawling Hand, Morvran has Bouncer. So there's already, two classes that have a very consistent way to kill this early on. And then also every class can run Draenor. You could even run Toxil if you wanted to, but you don't need that sort of 4 damage. You could just go Whir the opponent into it as Venescula, or you could just go Rolo, which everyone can run as well, into it. Right? There are a number of ways to make this slightly more palatable to kill, because you don't really want to tank yourself down to 10 HP putting this in slot 1. But people even still do that, and I think the fact that people even consider doing that is just a testament as to how ridiculous and strong Tormented Demon is. I know it's not good to talk about the game in terms of like the, of optimal, ideal, the very best openings you can get, but something like Slime Toes, Tormented Demon, Jad, the fact that that's possible is just absurd, right? That's like 5 base attack by the end of Chapter 1, and then you're just set. You can slam Ice Niles, you're almost ready to slam Cullies. It's just so good. Like, gold decks do not have anything like that, right? What are we comparing gold to? There's nothing that gives you a base attack and a 4 attack weapon. Like, what do we got? Golden Hammer, Rance, just like overcosted stuff compared to, I can just play Slime Toes into TD, and then I get a base attack. And even if I don't kill a Jad or 2 Jads, I can use that 4/2 weapon to kill something like Ogre Chieftain, or Ogre Warlord, sorry, or Dagannoth Sentinel, or something like that. It just gets you started so quickly. This card is way too good. It's just, like, one of the key facilitators in so many strong decks right now. I think the way you fix this is you just remove some of the potential there. I think a 4/1 weapon would be adequate, because then you could use it in mostly the same way that it's currently being used. You can, kill a TD and then kill a Jad directly afterwards, but even that I think might still be too strong. I think the fact that you can just so easily kill TD and then Jad straight away is just a big player in why so many AP decks are consistent. I think you need to remove that consistency element as well to some of these key strong decks currently in order for gold to ever be viable. I think the key point I'm making is that gold just does not have the same tools that straight-up creature decks have. Like, Tormented Demon is unparalleled. There's nothing else that does that. Certainly nothing that, generating gold will give you. Just too good of a card. Alright, the final card I want to talk about is Ogre Chieftain, and I think this card is just quite obviously too good. I don't really think it needs much discussion. I think the best thing to do is compare it to just another card, like, for example, Black Demon. So, Ogre Chieftain, right? Does damage equal to your opponent's base attack. Actually, does damage equal to your opponent's total attack. So, you could basically rewrite that as rival strikes themselves. So, right? You could kind of say it's like that. So Ogre Chieftain's kind of like a strike. It's not you striking them, but it's kind of like them striking them. But I still think that's a strike nonetheless in most matchups. Black Demon just says strike rival, right? I think these two are directly comparable. Alright, next. Ogre Chieftain says deal 4 damage to rival, on top of the strike. Black Demon says deal 4 damage to both legends. So I think we can see that this one is strictly better than this one. Alright, next up. Ogre Chieftain's a 2 gold reward. Black Demon does not have a 2 gold reward, so clearly strictly better. And then one says, well, do exhaust, and Ogre Chieftain does not have exhaust. And okay, in some very rare circumstances you'll want to exhaust, but the vast majority of the time it's just strictly better to not exhaust, right? This is clearly the better outcome. So I think Ogre Chieftain is just decisively, obviously better than something like Black Demon, but you could even do this comparison to something like Ketzek, or whatever card you want. Ogre Chieftain's just too good. I think what you ought to do is remove maybe one of these things on it. I think the gold reward is maybe the best place to start. Maybe the deal 4 damage is the best place to start. Just something needs to go. Something has to give. This card is really, really strong. The final 2 cards I wanted to talk about are Earth Blast and Tetsukatana, but I'm not going to talk about them in this video. I think that will be best saved for the gold video, or maybe a video where I talk about class cards in particular. But thank you very much for listening. My name has been Interjection. Do leave a like if you thought this was interesting, or if you think we should go ahead with these balance changes. Feel free to comment. I really would be interested to see what other people have come up with. And as I mentioned, gold video to come soon. Goodbye.